been a pleasure to be here with all these history buffs. And so I did a little bit of history this morning myself. I thought, well, how long ago did we start this project? So I got into my emails and I scrolled down, and the first email that came through on this project was March 2013. And it starts like most projects, it's just a phone call. Would you be interested? The ship channel is going to be 100 years old next year, and we're working toward having all sorts of events associated with it, and we think you all, with your history with PBS, would be a good choice for doing a documentary with an historical perspective, and also for interviewing people who work the port. So these things don't happen overnight. It is a long and arduous task, and that's why I asked earlier if anybody else was a documentary filmmaker here. Jim, my business associate and co-producer and co-founder of Texas Foundation for the Arts, would say that he's the first one to talk anybody out of wanting to be a documentary filmmaker. We talk to a lot of young people who want to, who know that we do this and want to know how to get it done and how to do this. And he's like, well, you want to first take a vow of poverty and then you're good. But the way that, it's sort of interesting, our projects all seem to dovetail into one another. And this one is no different. We had a friend who had been in our Galveston Island program who had called us and said, you would be a good group to do this. So we then thought, okay, this certainly represents the cultural aspect of the city of Houston and the region. And so therefore was true to our mission, which is to capture the uniqueness of Texas arts and culture. And so we thought, let's do this. And I think the first thing that we did was get down to the port. And that was interesting because we were escorted everywhere. You're no longer free to sort of roam the port area. You need to be escorted by members of the communications staff, and I think the police, the port police were driving the van that we were in. And so we really got to know the operations down there bit by bit as we went along. And, when you start a project like this, you're not really sure of what you're doing, so, or what the story is that you want to tell. So you need to define your topic. And at one point we thought, well, we could do sort of a day in the life of several people who, work the port. And our program ultimately turned out to kind of be that way, but that was going to be a little bit of a stretch to be able to follow these people the way that we wanted to. But we had to know, we had to begin by just doing a site survey and then just knowing what questions to ask. And that was really key to getting the right people to interview, because they are the ones who help you tell the story, and they ultimately, once you have the right people to interview, your story will come together for you. It is, when you sit down to an interview, we did several interview sessions for this program. You never know what you're going to get. Pat Jasper talked earlier about her oral history project not having any talking points prior to. But for video, it's a little different. People know they're on camera, and they need to feel a little more comfortable knowing what they're going to be talking about, as opposed to what their facial features may, rolling of the eyes and what have you in the middle of a good soundbite is like, oh, too bad. But so, we needed to be more concise. We ultimately interviewed probably about 30 people for the program, and I think everybody's in it. I don't think anybody was left on the cutting room floor, and we really work toward that, because you don't want somebody to really have given up their time and energy in preparing, to come to the interview and not have them, be a part of it. We did our editing, actually, at the editing company, and Nancy Clinton is here today. She is the owner of the editing company. Nancy, stand up and say hello. She was very well, helpful beyond measure, actually. And David Van Ness was the editor and director for our project, and that he really took it on and took a sense of ownership. And that's crucial when you're, in the editing suite, and you, especially toward the end of in post-production, obviously, you need to have somebody who's willing to just push through and remember a scene that he shot 3 months ago going down the ship channel and be able to put that in. So this project was interesting in that the port is a political kind of an entity. There are politics involved. And one group that we approached for funding, the funders wanted to know exactly what was going to be going on. Was this going to be an expose? Was this going to be some kind of a negative reportage? And what we really wanted to do was show what the port and ship channel contributes to the city of Houston and the economy of the United States, actually. So it's really we wanted to show it in the best possible light. You have a lot of hardworking people who work the port, and you've got, this symphony of things that are happening all at the same time in tandem, this choreography that goes on, and it's really an amazing place down there. And we were very fortunate to get to know how to use it. I mean, how to negotiate it down there. One of the disappointments for me on this project was that we were not able to use drone cameras as I wanted to do. And we had to use helicopters. The drones, are the latest technology. They just, and you can get up close and personal, and all this. And so I called the FAA here in the Houston area and said, this is for PBS. We are a nonprofit organization. This is not commercial. We would love to be able to have this, the use of the drone. And he said, you're about 6 months too early. And I read in the paper, I think a couple of weeks ago, that they're to the point that they're going to let filmmakers start using drones. So he was right. So we still have wonderful aerials in the program, and it's just too bad that we couldn't get up as close as I wanted to do. This is a 60-minute piece. We could have gone in 25 different directions, and originally our script was, I think about 50 pages long, Jim? 50 pages long for a script. And, you just have to start cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. And there were a lot of things that we would have loved to have included if we had really done a series, but we were bound by a 60-minute program. Really, I think earlier during the opening remarks everybody made, the group that really stood out to me were the pilots. I had no idea how important they were to the whole thing, and that's a whole documentary unto itself. The ILA, the International Longshorewomen, and the union is the Seafarers International Union. Those are crucial to the operations of the port, and that's a documentary series unto itself. One of the heartfelt disappointments Pat mentioned earlier was the passing of Father Rivers Patu. And he was the most wonderful Catholic priest who took it upon himself to do basically an ecumenical council of an International Seafarers Center, which is really unique in the country. If you go to other cities, like the Catholic Church will have their own place for Catholic sailors that are coming in from other places. The Presbyterian Church will have another place. And so he had one place. And Jim and I met with him for coffee, and we were having a great time looking forward to interviewing him, and then boom, he passed away. And that was when Pat Jasper was talking about how fortunate she felt that she was able to interview him. He would have added to the program because he had such knowledge. He was so salty. Here is this Roman Catholic priest who, you think, bless me, Father, but he could tell some stories, and a really great sense of humor, and really, it was disappointing that he passed away in the middle of things. And the other thing was the multi-generational aspect of what goes on at the port. If I may, Donald Gardner's, Andy's husband, said at one point during the film that he looks down into the hold and he thought, I'm looking down there and I'm seeing things that my father and my grandfather saw 30 or 40 years ago. And that was something that really came through to me as we were making this film, that there are people that really have a sense of ownership and a pride in this spot down there that not many Houstonians know about. So our mission with this program was to get out the word through our medium, television, so that people will hopefully be enlightened about just exactly what goes on down there and the contributions that so many people make on a daily basis down there. There's also a very interesting, talk about sidelines that you could go down a documentary unto itself. In the middle of it, down near Bayport, there is the grave site for the Yellow Rose of Texas in the middle of the port. So, it's like there's a historical marker and her resting site and, all this water around it, and you can see the big Bayport, cranes and everything else in the distance, and you're like, that's interesting. So there's quite a lot of history there. And as I said earlier, if we had known everything that we knew at the end of our program, at the beginning, it would have been a lot easier row to hoe. But I hope you'll all tune in on November 10th at 9 p.m. and watch the premiere of the show. We'll help with the Nielsen ratings for Channel 8, and I know they'll like that. So I'll turn it over to Jim Bailey.
Thank you, Kim. Okay. Isn't it great that we live in a city with the largest port in the United States and one of the largest ports in the world? How many people here are from Houston? How many people have actually seen the Houston Ship Channel? You've actually been to the channel? So you would know how to get there and give directions and so forth. That's amazing. So many people here really don't know a lot about the port. Sorry, I have to make notes. I'm not like him. I can't. So when you think of the Port of Houston, what comes to mind? Does anybody have a thought? Oil? What else? Commerce? What else? Huh? Right, the ecology. And the port has such a great history. I grew up in Houston, and we always heard about the port and so many legendary things doing with the coordinated with the port. And of course, we often remember the famous Athens Bar and Grill. Does anybody remember the Athens Bar and Grill that used to be out on Clinton Drive, where the Greek sailors would go when the ships docked, and the Houstonians would go out there and drink ouzo and dance the Greek dances with the sailors. Those were great times. I don't think it's there anymore. But the Port of Houston and the Houston Ship Channel is a fascinating entity that most of us, or most people in Houston, know very, very little about. So when we began work on the documentary project, we had to determine what is the story and what will interest television viewers. And also, as we began the research, we had to differentiate between the Port of Houston and the Houston Ship Channel, which are two entities, but at the same time, they're very well connected. First of all, when we began the research, we came here to the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, here in the Texas Room in the Idison building. We also researched the Port of Houston archives and their files, newspaper files, the vertical files, all here in the Idison building. We studied books such as David Falleur's Sheer Will and the Sibley book, The Port of Houston History. Both of those books give great information about the port. We researched the photo archives here at the HMRC and also at the Library of Congress. We reviewed thousands of photos and then acquired the photos we felt would tell the story or capture the feel for a certain era, whether it was the Civil War, the 1900s, the 1920s, World War II, or the 1950s. We researched the Port of Houston photo archives, as well as many other histories written about the port in various publications. So it was months of research to kind of flesh out the story. At that point, film crews captured more than 30 hours of interviews with historians, eyewitnesses, and others with information about the ship channel. And after all these months of research, we decided on the theme and the storyline for the documentary, and it would be a combination of the history of the ship channel and a behind-the-scenes look at how the port operates. We thought people would be interested in knowing what goes on behind the gates out there. So the creative team determined that the purpose of the documentary was to document the history of the port and to increase public awareness about the port. Then we reviewed all of this information, compared that with the photos that we had and with other visuals that were available, and came up with the first draft of the script as we began to craft a story and a timeline from this information. Eventually, the editors had about 10,000 images that they worked from to create this hour-long documentary. And the Houston Ship Channel story really began in 1836 when the Allen brothers first founded Houston and realized the opportunity for shipping goods into and out of Texas, or the Republic of Texas as it was then. The first great cargo was cotton, and then came oil and petrochemicals. So the highlights of the story, or the highlights of the documentary, are the history of the port, how it all began, the dredging of Buffalo Bayou, and a behind-the-scenes look at how a modern port operates. We had some really interesting scenes with the longshoremen and also the Houston pilots. And we also documented the changes in operating a port from the traditional ship methods of loading with pallets to containerization, and the growth of containerization and how Houston fit in with all of this. We were also able to feature some of the landmarks along the ship channel, such as the Fred Hartman Bridge and the San Jacinto Monument. People have asked, what did we learn when creating this documentary? And I would have to say we learned quite a lot. I thought I knew a lot about Houston history, but for instance, the father of the port was our congressman at the time, Thomas Ball. And how many of you have heard of there's a town named after him? We call it Tomball, but it was interesting that he's the one who actually arranged most of the congressional funding for the port and fought the struggle. We also learned about the competition with Galveston in the early days between the Port of Galveston and the Port of Houston. Galveston had quite an attitude and thought that Houston would never become a major port. And it was a decade-long struggles to create the port and get the funding and the dredging so that it could become a deep water channel. We also considered the educational aspects because we knew the documentary would be distributed to students in the Harris County schools. And we wanted to make sure that they were interested in and they understood the rich history of Houston and the port and the importance of the port to our city and our economic livelihood. And as Kim mentioned, there were many other angles of the story that we could have gone on to almost a dozen documentaries of all of these stories. It was quite hard to determine what made the final cut. But it came out to be a great story. The title of the documentary is Houston Ship Channel, Deepwater Centennial. It was a tremendous undertaking, a lot of work, but it's really rewarding to see the finished product and to know we've documented this history of the port and this important port of Houston. So we're going to ask for questions, or anybody have any questions or comments?
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out. I appreciate it very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to talk about Charles Morgan and the genesis of the Houston Ship Channel. We're going to shift a little bit, and we're going to talk about an earlier period than our last speakers did, which is a period that I'm particularly interested in the 19th century. And that was, in the 19th century, in fact, and Charles Morgan's efforts were critical to the creation of the Houston Ship Channel that we know today and celebrate today that opened in 1915. First, very briefly, a little bit about a little bit of background, both as to the geography and the political and cultural things that were going on in the 19th century. As many of you know, Houston Ship Channel sits at the end of along Buffalo Bayou. Buffalo Bayou runs roughly east-west from downtown, and it joins the San Jacinto River right near the San Jacinto Battleground, and that forms San Jacinto Bay, which then empties into Galveston Bay proper. And Galveston Bay is about 40 miles north to south, and it finally enters the Gulf of Mexico at Galveston Island. Galveston Island was the best natural harbor on the Texas coast, and that was what caused Galveston to grow very rapidly in the 19th century. Galveston was the primary port of entry for most people coming to Texas. The land routes to Texas were not very good, not very good quality. We had no connection to the eastern United States or to any part of the United States. We had no connection by rail until well after the Civil War. And so most people coming to Texas came during the Republic period and through the first part of statehood, came by sea, and they came through Galveston, although some came also from Indianola further down the coast. As a result, as our earlier speaker said, this gave Galveston quite the attitude because Galveston felt not completely without justification, that they had a monopoly on good harbor, on port facilities, and they made things very difficult for folks inland, including folks in Houston. Galveston was a real sore spot when it came to commerce and trade here in this area, because although Houston, which became the early railroad center of Texas, although Houston provided access to the interior of the state, Galveston was a bottleneck. Galveston had a bit of a monopoly on trade because everything came through Galveston, and like every monopoly, Galveston took advantage of it. And so early on, there was a lot of interest and a lot of desire on the part of Houston to find some way to get around the monopoly that Galveston had on good port facilities and develop Houston's own port facilities and its own trade that wasn't dependent upon those stuck-up people down on the island. And I say that as a native Galvestonian. My subject specifically is Charles Morgan. Now, Charles Morgan was a Connecticut Yankee. He grew up in a little town called Clinton, Connecticut, that name will become important later. Very early on, he entered into the shipping business. The thing that's important to remember about Charles Morgan and throughout his entire career and what made him so successful was that he was a pioneer of integrated transportation. And what I mean by that is that he recognized that it wasn't enough to just own a shipping company and to control one route between one port and another. What Charles Morgan recognized is that to be successful, his model of success was to control all the feeder routes that came into that. And I'll give you an example. It's not from here, it's from further down the coast. At the height of the Morgan Line's influence, we think of the Morgan Line as being a maritime transportation company. At the height of the Morgan Line's influence, you could go into the Morgan Line agent's office in San Antonio and buy a through ticket all the way to New Orleans. One payment, one ticket that was broken out into multiple parts. Now, it was a little bit convoluted traveling because first you would take a stagecoach from San Antonio to Cuero, and then a train from Cuero to Indianola, and then you get on a steamer from Indianola to Galveston, and then you get on another steamer and go from Galveston to Brashear, Louisiana, now Morgan City, and there you would get on a train, and the train would take you to New Orleans. Nonetheless, Morgan owned interest or controlling interest in all of those individual elements, and all the schedules were coordinated. And you would pay one fee and buy one ticket that had all of those things covered in one thing, in one purchase. And so that made travel much simpler for the traveling public, and it helped give him enormous control over transportation across the South. Morgan's first effort into Texas came at the beginning of the Republic period. This is his first steamship in the Gulf that he owned outright, the Columbia, and it ran between New Orleans and Galveston. He filled the Gulf with steamers very much like this, and several of them were lost in fairly infamous disasters back in those days, as happened quite a bit. But nonetheless, this was the genesis of the Morgan line and Morgan's maritime interest in the Gulf. It's as old as the city of Houston, the city of Galveston. It's as old as the Republic of Texas itself. By the coming of the Civil War, Morgan controlled most of or a great deal of the passenger trade, regular passenger trade in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a photograph of Central Wharf in Galveston. This was taken, if you're familiar with Galveston, if you know the Hindley building down on the Strand, this photograph was taken from the top of the Hindley building looking toward the wharf. And this is probably, I got way ahead of myself. This is probably one of Morgan's steamers, although we haven't been able to identify which one. The photograph is not quite clear enough, but that would be a very common sight in Galveston on the eve of the Civil War, and this is actually about where the Alyssa is docked today. When the Civil War came along, obviously that disrupted the trade and maritime commerce in the Gulf of Mexico. Texas seceded along with 10 other states. The Texas coast was blockaded, and many of Morgan's ships, which were located in ports all around the South, which was where his shipping empire was, many of his ships were taken over by the Confederate government and seized by the Confederate government and put into service. Morgan survived by continuing to build ships and leasing them or selling them to the Union Navy. In fact, this is a depiction by the artist Tom Freeman of the battle between the Hatteras and the Alabama, which occurred off the coast of Freeport. It's one of the few naval battles that actually happened in the Gulf of Mexico. The Confederate raider Alabama in the background actually sank the Hatteras, which was an extremely rare for a Confederate warship to sink a Union warship. But the Hatteras at that point was in the Navy, but the Hatteras had actually been built as a steamboat called the St. Mary for the Morgan line. And it was brand new. It had just been completed when the war began. And so Charles Morgan agreed to sell it, and he sold it to the Navy, and it became a naval vessel. After the war, Morgan came back. He began to rebuild his empire, his maritime empire in the Gulf of Mexico. This is one of his. This is actually a sister ship of the St. Mary or the Hatteras. This is a ship called the Harlan. It was built in 1866, and it operated out of first Galveston and then out of Buffalo Bayou, actually, up until the early 1880s. And it's very typical of the type of steamships that Morgan was running, iron-hulled, constructed of iron, side-wheel steamers, because they're not very high-tech, but they were very reliable, and they were coastal steamers. They were only intended to make a run of a few days' passage between the Texas coast and New Orleans, or the Texas coast and Florida or Mobile. You know, I talked a minute ago about the importance of integration of the different modes of transportation. In this post-war period, Morgan was, at the same time he was rebuilding his shipping fleet, he was also investing in all the connections to it. And in the 1870s, he began buying interest in the railroads that were operating out of Houston, including the Great Northern Railroad and this railroad, the Houston Texas Central. The H&TC, probably some of you are familiar with the line, although if not the name. The H&TC runs north to Hempstead, and then a branch of it runs west to Austin, and then the other branch runs north from Hempstead all the way up to the border at Denison on the edge of what was then Indian Territory. where it connected with the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, and that gave it connections to St. Louis, Chicago, and points east. So Morgan was very interested, and he was building up this. He was building up this integrated system of transportation that it depended on more than just ships.
Mm-hmm.
He also began buying interest in the Houston Direct Navigation Company. Houston Direct Navigation Company was a company that ran steamboats on Buffalo Bayou. This is Allen's Landing in about 1868. This is the steamboat St. Clair that began operating here out of Buffalo Bayou in late 1865. And Morgan bought interest in that, and by the 1870s he actually had controlling interest in that. So he was very heavily invested, not just in the shipping in the Gulf, but also in the other means of transportation along Buffalo Bayou and the railroads that extended beyond. This is where it gets interesting. In 1873, this is a dredge here on Buffalo Bayou. In 1873, Morgan made a request. He actually came in person, and he appeared before the Galveston Wharves Board. And he asked the Galveston Wharves to cut him some slack on the very high rates that Galveston Wharves were charging him and other shippers. Basically, his pitch to them was, the Morgan line, my line, the Southern Steamship Company, has helped make Galveston. You need to cut me some slack. We need to work together. Give me a discounted rate. And they refused. They declined to do it because they felt very confident that they had a monopoly and Morgan would have to give in. Morgan said, this may be apocryphal, I don't know. It sounds like it. Actually, it sounds like Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. But Morgan apparently said, if you don't work with me now, I'll bring my own dredges and I will dredge a deep water channel so that my deep water ships can go all the way to Houston. And the day that channel opens is the last day that one of my steamships will ever dock at the port of Galveston. And supposedly, the Wharves Board in Galveston laughed at him to his face. Not a good idea. Because the next year, in 1874, Morgan began gathering dredges and barges for carrying dredging spoil and mobile platforms, and he actually began assembling them in Galveston Bay, and he began cutting a channel, a deepened channel up Galveston Bay. By mid-1875, he had 8 dredges, 6 steam tugboats, and 12 movable derricks and other barges working on this channel. They cut a deeper channel through Redfish Bar, which was an obstacle across the middle of Galveston Bay. They cut a deeper channel through Half Moon Shoals, which is another channel. And the critical thing he did, the most important thing he did, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. And the most important thing he did was at Morgan's Point. Morgan's Point is not named for Charles Morgan. That's just a coincidence. But the most important thing he did was at Morgan's Point, at the bottom end of San Jacinto Bay, the San Jacinto battlefield would be a little bit off screen up and to the left. But at Morgan's Point, he cut a channel directly across Morgan's Point. You can see it here. This is a 1926 chart. He cut a channel, half-mile long channel, 120 feet wide, 9 feet deep, right through Morgan's Point. And that was the only way that a deep draft vessel could access Buffalo Bayou, because they couldn't get through the other shoals around Clopper's Bar at the entrance to San Jacinto Bay. And as soon as he cut that channel, he put a chain across it. He did not become the huge shipping magnate because he played softball, right? He put a chain across it, and it was open. That channel was open, of course, to his own ships. It was open to vessels of, for example, the Houston Direct Navigation Company, because he owned part of that company as well. It operated under a different name, but it was part of his sort of empire. Everyone else had to pay a fee. And so that gave him unique, completely exclusive access to Buffalo Bayou by deep water shipping. The other thing he did was he built his own little port, and he created a port called Clinton after the town in Connecticut where he grew up. And Clinton was located about where Galena Park is. It's on the north side of the ship channel, about halfway between downtown Houston and San Jacinto. And he dredged the channel to a depth of 9 or 10 feet. He dredged Buffalo Bayou all the way up to Clinton, but no farther. Instead, what he did was he built rail lines from the center of Houston 8 miles out to Clinton. I'm not sure I'm pointing in the right direction. But he built rail lines, and so so all the cargoes and all the goods coming into Houston would then get transferred by rail to Clinton, where he built warehouses and he built wharves and he built cotton presses, pressing the bales of cotton so that they could be stored efficiently in ships' holds. That was another thing that they did in Galveston. He had cotton presses built here on Buffalo Bayou, and they were actually situated so that the trains would roll up. They would roll the cotton bales off the cars into the warehouses, through the press, down to the wharf, onto the barge or onto the ship, and down the channel. Off it goes. Houstonians were thrilled when Morgan announced his plan to bring deep water ships to Houston, because they had envisioned that he would bring deep water ships all the way to downtown Houston, all the way to Allen's Landing. That had been their dream. And they also loved it because they were finally going to stick it to those folks in Galveston who had been taking advantage of them for decades. They were very disappointed to discover that what Morgan actually did was create his own little port halfway up the bayou